all with great titles, including Wild. Is it Wild Sociology? No.
Yeah, that was the subtitle to Making Sense Together.
And what's the most recent one that you did?
Well, month. Yeah,
coming out right
it's on the media.
Okay. And John's title today is Blindness and Insight, Ratman's Choreography.
I'll tell you what I'm doing. I have a seminar where we read Freud's principal 5 case histories, which have lovely names like Ratman, Wolfman, the woman case Dora, very important for feminist criticism, Schreber, a mad lawyer who became God's wife, and Little Hans, a 3, 4, 5-year-old kid who was psychoanalyzed by Freud and his father. On each of those cases, there are thousands of items, just thousands. As you know, Freud has been reread by Lacan and, say, Derrida, and unread by, curiously enough, Lacanian-based feminist criticism. So you know that there's the end of storyability announced by Lyotard narrativity. Big story takes marks and go forward. Perhaps no story goes forward. I'm putting that in graphic language. The idea that we try to map things using that male like logocentric narrative, logical graphic, just to call that geography, geography. There's a lovely sentence in Dora about symptomatology being a sexual geography. So it says, here's a wonderful sexual geography when you can displace from here to here or from here to there. And I'm saying that underneath, to talk like a feminist, underneath the geography, there is always the Earth as a Mother Earth body. I'll just call that Gaia-graphy. So, and the Gaia-graphy is, I'm saying, what in a sense is erupting, and I use the language of skidzing or choresis. It's causing this mainline story to keep going crazy. And then Freud's endlessly trying to recover from what's driving the story crazy. It's another way perhaps to look at pornography, rewriting the body between these two things. Now it's quite detailed in the text. The way we work in the seminar is if we can take any page, and if you find, say, a parenthesis, given that Freud's running the show, why does he need a parenthesis? That's something funny is going to go on there. Usually something even funnier is going on in a Freud footnote. He'll say, and he'll be pushing a sort of readable line through the case history, and in the footnote he'll probably say, actually this bloody patient's not readable at all. I've got a feeling that she's homosexual, something like this, and then a totally another story goes through the footnote. Another symptomatic place is a map, and I've given you, there's a map about, to try to bring together what Ratman's crazy enterprise of trying to get to two places at once to settle a debt. The map has to be recorrected. Now, Freud's an elegant guy. He really can write. That his writing can't get to what he's dealing with, and he has to resort to an artifact like a map, and then in fact the map goes wrong. There's another symptomatic place, so I choose that as a place to think about. And that gives you this connection between the words. A railway map, but a train on that is a Zug, and a Zeuge is a word that means begetting. That's a different kind of getting process going through, creative, maternal, and Zeugness, witness. And then you'll find a long story of witnessing whereby woman is the most unreliable witness. Only males can truly witness. And they witness by holding one another's testicles and affirming that so-and-so is the case. So that's another part of the paper. Now then there's another thing that Freud himself had what he called a trained neurosis. And that goes back to a famous time he seems to have remembered when he was on the train leaving their natal village to go to Leipzig or wherever, and he saw the naked mother body, and he knew that his mother loved him more than anybody else, and that he really loved her and was ready to kill his dad to get to her, and so on. So he remembers things like that. Freud also had that the Ratman case is unusual in that it's the only case for which there are process notes, that is to say, something like the original transcript in Freud's hands. These are remarkable things. Freud wrote on sheets like that, straight across, almost nothing in between, and almost no mistakes. But they're edited to some degree in the published version. In any case, in there, there's a connecting term. The very last thing on the handout is a word, or Gesellsamen. Gisela is a woman whom Ratman loves but doesn't want to marry for all sorts of reasons I'm going to tell you about. And Gisela Fliss, who is like Wilhelm Fliess, but Gisela Fliss was Freud's first love. And so in the process notes, when Gisela comes along, Freud has these 3 exclamation points, Gisela. Now I'm mentioning all of that because it's a way to see the actual detail of a transference, or counter-transference, that the Ratman has had a flick through Freud's stuff before he comes to see him. He just wow him. And Freud is into Ratman because of all sorts of subconscious associations and so on. Not to mention the real sociology of this, that these are Jewish families that are interlocked and interrelated and murderous of internally and externally. So you've got a whole overheated. Well, all right, I'll go to the paper. If you want very nice accounts of the case histories, Stephen Marcus, M-A-R-C-U-S, his book, Freud and the Culture of Psychoanalysis. He's a literary critic, but he gives wonderful accounts of some of these case histories. But in any case, he complains about RM in language like this, that his recollections cannot be straightened out. He says on, they're full of narrative activity, and like some Kafka stories, they're going nowhere at the same time. Further on down, straightening out the narrative information and ellipses does not alleviate the pathology or lead to a cure. It only leads to something more senseless and unintelligible than before. And he says, indeed, Freud himself becomes part of the patient's delirium. So there's a literary critic using the same metaphors as to be found in the case history and complaining in that sort of externalized way that he's writing, of course, a little bit pre-deconstruction and post-structuralist writing, not celebrating this inability to conclude, but complaining of it as a pathology that is ruining both doctor and patient. So another thing that I'll just point to you, that while a critic like Stephen Marcus is very careful and brilliant with the case history, in order to accomplish his interpretation, he completes them. And he completes them in the case of Ratman by finding their continuation in Dickens or in D.H. Lawrence. So you sort of, as a sociologist, you could say, well, this is what legitimates that sort of sense of, well, the story goes to the next movie, and then you can see it. So rather than do that, I'm trying to stick with this matter that Freud's central metaphor for trying to keep the thing on track, namely that of a train of thought, which is in German, a Denkverbindung, the binding together of the thought. That it's inextricably, his attempts to do that, fraught with unconscious association in Freud's own train neurosis, his Reisefieber, that he shared with Ratman, and that is productive in each case of a variety of delirious projects in which the two men are transported or driven, and from which neither could release the other. So that's what I'm going to try to follow up. I can't really tell you the whole case history, but it very quickly gets into trouble when Ratman is explaining that on a break while on military maneuvers, he heard this rat story, and Freud's got to get it out of him. And the other thing Ratman will be, he just before hearing the story, he loses his pince-nez, and in those days Europe was set up, and is still set up in such a way. The only counterpart to this is Japan, that if you lose something, you can get it back. In the case that you lose your glasses, whether you look for them or not, you simply write that day to Vienna, please send me a pair of glasses, and on the next train, a pair of glasses turns up. They can do things like that in Switzerland. Those are the places that do research, by the way. They are natural archives. So if you are, some Freudians love doing Freud history and looking for the patient really at the end of these stories. And it turns out they in fact find them because you go to Switzerland and you say, I'm looking for Ratman, and they say, well, you're not here today, but his aunt was through here and she lived up there, and we all know she had an affair with that guy, and he's the pastor of this, and if you go there, the thing just naturally falls in place. I don't do that, but it can be done. In any case, there are the two things. He lost his glasses, so in a certain sense he's all ears. He's disoriented. He's a body now to be read to or told to. And then after that he gets this mad story of trying to get his glasses back, and he believes he owes a debt to somebody that he doesn't in fact owe it. And I'll get into that. So early in the case history we're plunged into the rat story heard by R.M. while on military maneuvers, during which he had lost his glasses, and for whose return he held himself indebted, and the matter of the debt's important, to one of the officers, even though he feared repayment, rotten, repay something, might result in the infliction upon his father or his lover, a lady, of the very painful punishment by the rats, rotten, in the rat story. So you can tell we're into psychoanalysis now, anybody with trouble like that, okay? We should also keep in mind the military context in which a strange story is told from the little Foucault rat about a body rendered delirious by pleasure pain told to a company of young men whose bodies are subject to the rationalized discipline of a profession whose ultimate task is to suffer and to die in the name of the fatherland. Now there's a supplement to the rat story itself. It's a snippet probably from a novel of pleasure torture called The Torture Garden, sold in millions, and that's the background text. And it's interesting because in that, the rat story, the whole rat punishment is something that Clara, who has a rather weak lover, takes her lover to China. They have gardens and places where the young men are actually tortured this way, and she loves it, and her male lover can't quite stand it. So the Doridian supplement is reversed and stronger than in fact in its shortened version. Okay. Now Ratman has great trouble telling this story. He bounces up and down off his seat, begs Freud not to hold him to it, or to the couch from which he, as I say, it goes up and down as though already in pain. But Freud can't release him from telling the story. With an assurance that he had no desire to inflict cruelty on him, Freud undertakes to guess at, erraten, the story from any hints offered to him. Of course, by subjecting himself to such a game, Freud had already surrendered to the position of the child, or the girl, or Clara, in the torture garden, in the game of begging for it to go on, while each detail or hint sets up a sort of faute or narrative swing between itself and the story, its own secret of, in German that's Rätsel, another rat word, that simultaneously amplifies the physiological pleasure-pain swing between the two parties to the game. So from the case history itself, you have this extract then. Was he perhaps thinking of impalement? No, not that. The criminal was tied up. He expressed himself so indistinctly that I could not immediately guess, this is Freud, in what position. Ratman. A pot was turned upside down on his buttocks. Some rats were put into it, and he had again got up and was showing every sign of horror and resistance, bored their way in. The English translation says, into his anus I helped him out. but the German actually says, into his ass I filled him in. So Freud's already going more, he's gotten by the story. Like the rat within it, the rat story overwhelms its containing narrative, deliriously destroying its boundaries and direction. Once the rat story is told, it floods everything in an uncontrollable and undifferentiated alternation of horror, pleasure, horror that overturns the dike between sense and reason. Dike is a favorite Freud word from having gone to Holland. It's that kind of dike to keep, out what you want out and in what you want in. Or between fiction and reality, just as it sinks the difference between being animal and being human, or between being man and being woman. I'm using these as hyphenated terms to point you to a Deleuze-Guattari reading of Becoming Animal, Becoming Whatnot, which you can easily go to, I'm suggesting. The case of Little Hans being very important in this sense, because Little Hans is a becoming horse, becoming animal that Freud has to sort of turn back into becoming mummy or becoming daddy. This collapse of the being animal, being human, being man, being woman, this collapse of abstract categories of difference is produced by the regression to a level of anal eroticism whose intensity restores the inexchangeable value of the fecal phallus. That may be a new phallus for you. The anal retention of body pleasure overwhelms both the storyteller and the listener, so that each must beg the other for its completion. To beg in this way is to be, I've got it too passively there, is to be sodomized or fucked, but it's the alternation by the rat story. Either way, anyway, so long as it doesn't stop. A mark of the struggle between delirium and control induced by the story is retained in this is my linguistic usage, fuck to surrender and sodomize to be in control, inasmuch as the former resorts to colloquial vulgar speech while the latter controls its reference through a less colloquial or biblical usage. Between these two linguistic strategies lies a third possibility in which the sight, the place and the view, and functions of the organs of excretion, micturation, ejaculation and copulation are rendered obscene so that they may be used as curses, invoking either injury or blessing. And the Gisela Salmon word at the very end of this that you have is a mixture of a woman's name and the man's semen, and it's a kind of an onanistic, copulatory curse. We'll come to the unpacking of some of that. The confusion of terms repeats the body's own vulnerability and pleasurability, but amplifies it on the level of the body of language, which is the site of psychoanalysis, just as the arts of love are reinscribed in the love of the arts, of storytelling, and in this case, of the case history. At this point, Freud says he's forcibly reminded of the double-sided Slav curse of arse-fucking, found in a periodical called Anthropophyteia. This is very important. I spend my time going to look for Anthropophyteia. Turns out that what the story is, it's a typical, if you know the work of Lebov, or much music is so totally ruined by rap-type songs, but they're simply verbal raps, and verbal raps always have the same structure. You have to put your opponent down, so if you get him first, you potentially got him down. A way to put him down is to degrade him sexually or through his mother's sex or his sister's sex, and the way to get back is to, find a place of his weakness. But more than that, if the guy says something, there's a rule that to really play the game, you must take up his last word and create a sentence that will rhyme back off that last word. So it's quite a fine art. Something that maybe Duke University would be interested in, because it shows, really great, actually, sociolinguistic skills. So what happens is that when you trace down this sort of seemingly recondite and exotic footnote in Freud, it's just another version, folkloric or crude, however you want to look at it, version of the rat story. So, but it means that Freud can only, it's through his transcendence processes now that he's building up more and more references. And I think it's the sort of thing that makes Freud think that what he's doing is a science, because This particular case is related to a piece of folk memory, folk practice, whether it's Hamlet or Sophocles or a rap like this. It gives him a sense that that's how the evidence is generalizable. So kind of his phenomenology is, well, this case is good enough. I don't need to see millions of them. So having thus entered into, or having himself been thus entered into by the story, Freud attempts to extricate himself by commenting upon Ratman's unnoticed figure or face of horror and pleasure. Freud will, you see this often in the case history, he tries to put him, after having transferred a little bit this way, he tries to put himself back into medical face, and you'll get a whole slew of, for example, gynecological metaphors that have really no place at all except to give him this kind of affected distance. Or he'll create weird Latino, Greek named words for any kind of bodily discharge. And so he's through that language, he's regaining the distance that the one-on-one oral intercourse is transgressing. So, as though he himself had not lost his analytic composure and regressing to a level where the organ of sight and sound are overwhelmed in an anal fecal phallic pleasure that offers a model of jouissance in continuous conflict with the law of heterogenital jouissance. Witness the blur in Freud's insistence upon a primal scene, which is always specifically coitus ad tergo, and his invention of the composite anal genital orifice. There's an absolute blur in Freud's mind. He also claims in a piece of what I call bad video positivism, that coitus ad tergo is the best scene in which to experience, for which you can be an observer to it's the best content of the primal scene. It allows you to see what's going on in the primal scene. Well, it doesn't. I've had my class and myself experiment with that. There's not too much to be seen. All video porn has to get in from the side. But back to back, you get Shakespeare's Beast of Two Backs. You don't get. So, Freud's into that much trouble, and then since I make the suggestion then that you treat all the literary associations that Freud in fact got, then this story from the torture garden is pushing him even further and further along. Since that's a long chunk, I just let it go. I won't read it as such. I'll interpret a little bit. The delight of this rat story, then, as it's unfolding for Clara, consists in the delirious breakdown of person positions, the declension or fall from first person to second person to third person, shifting from narrator to narratee, from perpetrator to victim, from male to female, just as the scurrying rat twists and turns upon itself within the victim's body, that in turn twists and turns in the thrall of pain and pleasure. Once the listener-reader is drawn into the game, or the viewer, if you were a viewer to the primal scene, and I'm trying to suggest that you've got to go through all person positions to make the primal scene thing work, there is no exit, because each pause, each exit, turns into re-entrance, a repetition of the pleasure-pain cycle, produced by maddening the rat with the hot rod prod from the forge, or desire for the story, that connects the pot belly to the anus, to the belly of the victim, in repeating spirals of pain-pleasure that overwhelm all the senses. At the same time, the aesthetic sublime achieved in the horror of the story repeats a physiological law on the level of the body, whose flesh cannot tolerate simultaneous biting and tickling. It's funny, it's announced as a great law of human physiology that you cannot stand to be both bitten and tickled. Tucker Parson would call that conditioned love. I think Bates would probably call it double bind. But it's interesting how it turns up there. And the Chinese are said to be the Chinese and the Turks are higher civilizations in as much as they develop fine arts of breaking that law. I think we break it in the ghetto only, something like that. But in any case, The violation of the physiological law is repeated as sexual violation that in turn violates each of the sexes by the other, thus collapsing sexual difference in the frenzy of the story. But even more, the hot rod that penetrates the rat, that penetrates the anus male or female and then penetrates the belly female or male, also violates the law of copulation by destroying its pleasure in the production of death rather than the reproduction of life, subject in turn to the physiological law of pain-pleasure homeostasis. So the case, if you were thinking, I'm going to see what a case history is, you open it up, and it's like one of my first experience opening up. I figured when I was 15 or 16 it was time to leave home and the maddening conversation of my parents and talk to guys like Socrates. And so I went to public library and I got down to work and I got out a dialogue. I thought, there was dialogue, and you pick up the dialogue and it says, "Good morning, how are you, Socrates?" Socrates says, "Geez, I'm just totally blind. It's a hell of a night last night and I can't find my sandals." And oh shit, Jesus, this is a dialogue. And it's the same way you go to the case history. Within 2 minutes you're into this wild story that has a whole set of other wild, even more wild connotations. And Freud has more or less got a patient at the end of this and he's still got to get out all the analysis and God knows what. So you'll find then places where Freud continuously trying to sort of pull the thing back. So I cite a text then. "So far we have heard only one idea of the rat punishment being carried out upon the lady," but it's more than one idea. He was now obliged to admit that a second idea had occurred to him simultaneously, namely the idea of the punishment also being applied to his father. As his father had died many years previously, his obsessive fear was much more nonsensical even than the first. This is the sort of Holmesian discourse in Freud. This is actually a serious mental puzzle here, and we've got to sort that out. And he goes into that kind of prose. Now I'm saying the simultaneity of the two fantasies is not scandalous simply with respect to its achronology, that the father's dead and his girlfriend is alive. I think it rather expresses a further de-differentiation between the generations, a collapse of the Oedipal spacing and a reversal of love and hatred in the order of parental punishment. What I'm going to be suggesting here is through what a notion that Lacan calls the family myth. There's a myth that probably more important than the primal scene that affects a child is not so much, I think I can hear my parents screwing next door or on top of me or wherever they do it, but they have heard a long story of injustice or betrayal or deception, and I'm suggesting that the infant inherits this story as a debt that it must repay to one, if not both parents. So in my long version of what I hope to do with many of the case histories is to say that what the kid is trying to do is get reborn, and to resettle the marriage, and to achieve that, of course, it needs to come up with birth theories, and these birth theories, Little Hans is a gorgeous place for this, are faulty, because if you get into psychoanalysis at the age of 18 months to 60 months, you're liable to get it wrong, specifically because they won't tell you about copulation. They won't tell you how they actually get it done. They keep telling you stories about storks and stuff, and you have a sense of something wrong with that. And but there's a conspiracy, there's a gorgeous social conspiracy going on to hold you to the social mythology on that. So what I'm saying here is that Ratman's craziness has to do with trying to straighten out a quarrel between the parents. It's a quarrel then. The rat is the brat is the rat. The little kid in the story circulates in between what I call an individual myth and the family myth of an unrequited love. And that is the debt, really, that Ratman is trying to pay. So I'll give you a citation on the case history as read by Lacan. He says, "It's exactly right in the case of the Ratman to seize on the pact that presided over his parents' marriage, on something, therefore, that occurred well before he was born, and that Freud should find the following conditions intermingled in it honor saved by a hair's breadth, a betrayal in love, social compromise, and prescribed debt, of which the great compulsive scenario that led the patient to him seems to be the cryptographical tracing off, and finally motivates at last the impasses in which his moral life and his desire are lost. Well, that's relatively clear Lacan, but you can at least hear in it all the gorgeous makings of a lovely theatre piece, interesting story, etc., etc. So what is this? What is it that it's not just this rat story, it's not just the enterprise of imagining that if he makes love with his lady, it will kill his father. If he does what his father does, it will kill his lady. There's something between his father and his parents. Now we need to know that his father was once a soldier and a gambler contracts debt, so that's a little bit of it. Someone then, a gambler is a Spielratter, someone has a Spielratter, has played with two loves and abandoned each for the sake of his love of gambling. Here there operate, well, I won't play around with that. Meanwhile, another one, namely mother, wishes the child of a marriage. In German, marriage is Heirat, and to marry is heiraten. She wants to marry her son to Gisela. Founded on sorry, I better go back. Meanwhile, another one, mother, wishes the child of a marriage founded upon money in place of an abandoned love to repeat the same contract. In other words, while Ratman's father had really been in love with a poor girl, he had married Ratman's mother for her money. But in turn, Ratman's mother always said, well, you never really loved me, you know, you loved this girl. And like that. But this time, when the kid has to repeat the paternal marriage, it's to marry, you need to know that Gisela can't have children. It's to marry a dead lady, Gisela, from whom there will be no love child. An issue, as I'm saying, would be made certain by the overlaying fantasy of coitus per anum. Thus the child assumes a family myth by placing himself in an impossible situation, in the primal indifferentiation of the scene of parental coitus, from where, as in the rat story, one cannot choose a point of view, despite the narratorial stance, because one is any one of the actors, voyeur, reader, listener, already caught in flagrante. So the child's desire, I'm arguing, to incorporate his dilemma repeats itself in this episode where he's trying to pay a debt to one of two officers. It's a debt that turns out to have been paid for him by a lady at the post office, but he thinks it's being paid by Officer A instead of Officer B, and he creates a huge story of which this map is Freud's attempt to try and straighten it out. Now, we go nuts too, so I have to just, I'm giving that for these purposes sort of docile treatment. That map won't help you anyway. There's a similar map in the case of Little Hunts, which is meant to explain the horse phobia by drawing the house and the street and the loading place. Such devices only produce more and more text. They don't dampen down the text. And in the handout I gave you, where there's this taken from a regular psychology book, the metaphor of a train of thought is called a peremptory idea system. And you can see the railway map turned into two maps again. And this is almost a 40-page article, and as it's going along, it's generating more and more footnotes and text to just repeat the simple notion, try to positivize the notion of a peremptory idea system, one that will go forward, and nevertheless an unconscious peremptory idea system, as though it sort of clears up Freud's trouble. My point is that it really cannot possibly do that, because such versions of the peremptory idea system treat conscious and unconscious like that and try to put them back on the same sort of railway mapping device, when the point is that if you take the unconscious seriously, and that's really the Freudian discovery, is the unconscious, and that the beauty of the Freudian text is that it's undone by its own unconscious. So you cannot get the language of the conscious and the unconscious ever on the same plane of speech. Now that's a different way of talking, I think, than, say, it occurs to me to suggest to you anyway that it's a Freudian enterprise of saying that the text can't go forward because its margins can always overwhelm it. I think it's a kind of academic practice whereby people like us make notes on the margin to a text with intent to rearrange it, where it's not exactly the same deeper notion of what the unconscious does, and what the unconscious has to do to become structured like a language. Lacan says it is structured like a language. What I'm trying to suggest by putting Zeugness together is not a play on words. That's the after effect of the unconscious having gotten itself into such a linguistic chain, and then the effects of that. Let's, well, it says a function of this mad railroad road that in the end of it, Ratman comes to Freud. He's also had a look in the psychopathology of everyday life, and he's hoping to get from Freud a certificate that will permit him to go back into the army and repeat this damn journey again to get this debt paid. And that's at that point that the case history starts. So, I'm playing then with the idea of the train, the Zug, the work of the metaphor of the train of thought, that the work of the metaphor of the Zeug, and Freud as witness, Zeuge, who would give a Zeugness, a certificate to Ratman that he go back into that thing. So now I'll try to focus on why Freud was compelled to persist with Ratman, despite the extraordinary trouble he experienced in getting the case history on a clear path to the rat idea. So I'll briefly state the solution. The rat story had especially affected Ratman because he had always identified with his father's life as a soldier, despite his mother's disapproval of her husband's vulgarity and the stories that he'd had bad gambling debts. So in trying to pay his own debt on the pince-nez, Ratman had undertaken to redeem his father's sin. Freud's term for it is Jugendsünde, his youthful sin. In fact, the sin lay deeper. I'm suggesting that what Ratman was hiding from himself in the post office episode is that he had aroused the affection of the innkeeper's daughter at the post office, and near the post office, and of the post office lady, so that he was uncertain on which of these two ladies to bestow his favors once the maneuvers were over. So there's a sexual maneuver underneath the military maneuver. Thus the game with the two officers covered his indecision between the two girls. But then, of course, this unconscious behavior can't possibly be mapped onto any spatio-temporal plane. And so the two railway maps not only fail as an improvement on one another, but are also specifically, i.e. psychoanalytically, irrelevant to the case narrative, in which they're nevertheless trapped as symptomatic of an obsessive text which the reader is also unable to resist trying to get straight. That's another seminar game. You could say to everybody, okay, let's straighten this map out, let's redraw it, and everyone will do it. You won't get drawn in. But I'm saying that the cartographic skids at this point is doubly determined by Ratman's own repetition of his father's youthful sin with respect to abandoning a first love, for which he deserved the rat punishment, and for his entering into a mésalliance whose sad tale Ratman had heard since childhood in the complaints of his mother, who was also Freud's unimpeachable witness, he calls her, Zeugness, to the episode of the child's rage at being punished by his father for having bitten someone. That's very early on. Along this line, which I'm calling the family myth, Ratman's whole life, his career and marriage, was blocked by his mother's plan for him, through which he tempted her son to repeat the father's sin of marrying for money rather than for love. But there are also overlaps between Ratman's family story and Freud's own family myth. So I suggest that Ratman's train neurosis has fascinated Freud as much as Ratman may have been fascinated by reading about Freud's own train neurosis, to which the artifact Zeug of the train Zug metaphor is also witness, Zeuge. For example, in Freud's story of how in Cologne he had missed his connection to Rotterdam, so they could see the Rembrandt collections in The Hague and Amsterdam on the way out to England rather than on the way back, as his eldest brother had suggested. Now that, if you just flick psychopathology, you find that sort of thing. So I think what goes on in Ratman's impossible journey is that Freud's obsessive attempt to clear an intelligible path and to set out the patient's train of thought is that it's ruled by his own unconscious associations, in this case with trains, in which he was no more in control of things than Ratman. Hence, so many of Freud's travel jokes portray a Jew at odds with Gentile culture, while other journeys are fraught with illicit love or patricidal ambition. Freud's entire life journey was marked by his own ambivalence. As a discovering scientist, he thought of himself as on a journey in which many of the stories, inset dreams and so on, are himself with a male companion being led to something by a woman, and then you get the idea that maybe Freud's going to leave this guy for the woman, but actually the woman gets abandoned as these guys discover each other. It's a sort of like what's that Vietnam movie, the Battalion, or what was it called? Platoon. You know, the guys are chasing each other in the jungle. That's their main occupation, and it keeps getting interrupted by the Viet Cong shooting at them or something. So Freud's entire life journey is marked by his own ambivalence on the one hand toward a powerfully seductive mother whose nude body had imprinted itself indelibly on his memory, and on the other hand toward a gentle father whose wife, and here there's another parental myth, that Freud seems to have taken on at least as much as well, I'll leave that out, a wife who may have been complicit with her husband's putting aside a barren second wife, Rebecca, who was like Gisela, who was also barren. Freud's father probably had 3 wives, and the second wife is missing. And the point about Freud loving his mother is that she was very young, and Freud's father had a couple of sons, Freud's brothers, who were about the same age as his mother. And one of them in particular, Philip, used to screw Freud around, and in particular Freud figured that he was screwing his mother. So you need to know that. So I've just said that. Freud tortured himself with that idea. Thus Freud's own family line, his genealogy then, is skidsed. Freud's own family line was not easily kept straight. In his heart, he'd never forgotten the family's move from Freiburg to Leipzig. It was the occasion of his earliest train journey, during which he first separated his own desire for the young nude mother, Mater Nuda, or Mater Nudan, from the seductions of his old nurse mother, Amma was her name, Amalie was his mother's name. Having taken upon himself his own womanhood, long enough to be opened up to the dream of psychoanalysis, Freud returned to the law of the father, splitting his 2 mothers into a pre-civilized goddess and a domesticated wife. Having split woman in this way, Freud was able to deliver from her the persona of lady psychoanalysis, as he calls her, sometimes calls her lady libido, and with her to run off on trips with Fliess in a wonderful marriage of science and imagination. By the same token, Freud's sexualized journey, Verkehr, a very important metaphor in the Dora case, to his congresses with Fliess raised the infant question, to whom do I belong? I'm suggesting that's the infant question, rather than how do I screw, but to whom do I belong? And this may well be the source of Freud's extraordinary footnote in Ratman's case, where the mothering question, I call her, becomes the origin of all obsessional thinking. And this footnote is absolutely fabulous for the geogeography switch, or for where all feminists would find Freud in flagrante switching, pulling a great civilizational switch. So I read it to you. The case histories, incidentally, are found easily in these Penguin Freud series, Case Histories 1 and Case Histories 2. And this passage is Case Histories 2, page 111, 112, 13, footnote. He says, as Lichtenberg says, quote, an astronomer knows whether the moon is inhabited or not with about as much certainty as he knows who was his father, but not with so much certainty as he knows who was his mother. All right? So it means you can always tell who your mum is. Little Hans could tell that. It gives you a pretty good idea of where you came from. But Dad, you can't tell. Could be anybody. So the puzzle is, how come we don't name that way down the mum, but down the dad? Okay? A great advance, then. Here we go. A great advance was made in civilization when men decided to put their inferences upon a level with the testimony, Zeugnis, of their senses, and to make the step from matriarchy to patriarchy, which actually means to disbelieve the testimony of your senses. Become an abstract theorist, a legal fictionist. He says the prehistoric figures which show a smaller person sitting upon the head of a larger one are representations of patrilineal descent. So you move the lady up on top of your head. Athena had no mother. Okay, it's a really neat way to stop that. But sprang from the head of Zeus. Okay? This is how Freud uses mythologies then. A witness, Zeuge, who testifies to something before a court of law is still called Zeuge, literally a Begetter in German. I've got a typo in there. Alluding, I think would be the word, to the part played by the male in the act of procreation. And so too in hieroglyphics, the word for Zeuge is written with a representation of the male organ. So what was happened there is that we've gone from the idea that males are useless for telling you some important fact about yourself. Mother, you always know who your mother is. You don't know who your father is. It becomes under the law. You know who your father is. You can't trust your mother. You put the woman's body under the patronym. So I'm saying here the skids in Zeuge is produced by Freud's own infantile incestuousness, disavowed by projecting onto the maternal body the uncertainty and doubt fed by a desire that reverses itself, contrary to all sensory evidence, despite Freud-Lichtenberg, in the subordination of the maternal evidence of conception, Zeugen, to the paternal law of recognition, adoption, procreation, fiction. Of course, the male Zeuge triumphs only through his capacity for creative legal fiction, if not Freud's science fiction. Thus, Freud embarked like Moses upon a lifelong journey to subject his followers to a law of fiction whose central command is that the jealous God will not tolerate woman's adulterous conception. Once again, Freud's unoriginal sin, if I may say so, is projected from a family scene onto the world stage, and from there read by him into the individual soul by a circuitous road of psychoanalysis. Now, there's another story where, right at the very end of his life, Freud Freud has another way of telling his life about a series of conquests, and they're scientific and also geographic, in the sense that he wants to go to Rome and he wants to go to Athens because these are the twin peaks or faulty towers of Western civilization, and you've got to have gone there. They have, of course, Athens is known as the mother of all cities. So if you can make it to Athens through your own professional prowess and have thus far exceeded your humble origins, which you owe to your father, then you have thereby exceeded your father and captured the mother from you. So that is the famous screen memory on the Acropolis, and I just want to say how this fits in then with the Gisela business and Freud's earliest girlfriend. Then we can. He's then trying to get to Athens, and it looks as though they're not going to make it, and then it turns out that after all they'll be able to make the journey. And Freud remembers it this way. And what I'm trying to point to is how Freud's always feminizing himself when he wants something in order to get it. And then when he's got it, he's, as it were, built the two sides into himself. We're going to Athens. Out of the question. It would be far too difficult. The accompanying depression corresponded to a regret that it was out of the question. It would have been so lovely. And now we know where we are. It's one of those cases of too good to be true, sounds like Harold, that we come across so often. It's an example of the incredulity that arises so often when we're surprised by a piece of good news, when we hear we've won a prize, for instance, or drawn a winner, or when a girl learns that the man she has secretly loved has asked her parents for leave to pay his addresses to her. Now we know that the train that took Freud to Vienna also took him away from his own first love, Gisela, to whose memory Freud always had a way of returning, of regretting having swapped the flowers of young love for the bread of adult marriage. Like Ratman, Freud's memory could reverse the track of time back to a fresh, golden love before his choice of a conventional marriage, in a return to, or return of, childhood that unsettles the dream-dreamer relation, just as the relation between the narrator and the listener is skidsed by the rat story. The counter-transference then between Freud and Ratman is further overlaid by their shared family myth, found in Ratman's magical word that so astonished Freud. Ratman had ways of speaking that would include negations stuck on at the last minute to the end of his sentences, so he always would not want something. And he has this word that he gives out as a kind of a prayer, mixture of prayer curse term, namely Gidgezamen. And Freud analyzes that. So what I did here, I pasted to the, since the process notes in German have not only been fully translated into French, I put the French translation, and then from the English version of the German process notes in the notes of the Vienna Society, I create this object then, which is itself an archaeological object, but it translates. And so the word at the very bottom, Freud turns Gisela then, Gidgezamen, he translates it into Gisela, the name of the girlfriend, Samen, my semen, Amen. So it's a, as it were, a masturbatory marriage. So what I'm saying, but it solves his problem of having, not having, and being thereby honoring the father, the debt to the father. Ratman's prayer contains the happy marriage of a first love, Gisela, and of himself, Samen, in an onanism à deux, repeatable for all such young loves, Freud and Gisela, whose memory always returns by a circuitous route. I would say that masturbation was a lifelong practice for Freud, but it's not, as he was also a fighter of the myths that it will ruin you. But what's more important is that when Freud is if he has a critique of masturbation, but it's not at the mythological level, mythobiological level, that it will ruin you or blind you. What he's concerned is what are the masturbatory fantasies, and they can be creative and uncreative. So that's what's important. So I think then that Ratman's masturbatory marriage, and Freud has a wonderful term in phrases, onanismus conjugalis. We perhaps have to, it's married masturbation. Now that overlays a lot. One of the contraceptive practices was coitus interruptus, and Freud thought that rendered people pretty neurotic. Then another sort of contraceptive practice that Freud himself practiced was to have all your kids quickly and get it over with and then get on with inventing a science. So Freud pumped 6 kids into his old lady, and then that was the end. He left her to her domestic neurosis while he, as he termed in Dora case, got on with his love of fleece and psychoanalysis. So I think the masturbatory marriage both spends and saves the father's seed, thereby honoring a double debt to truth and fiction. In Ratman's case then, Freud himself is obsessed with the double structure of a retroactive narrative concerning a debt owed to a former love, exchanged for the hard currency of a conventional marriage, and his own gamble on a career whose fees were perhaps the thin veil of rationality over a counterfeit in which the patients fed the doctor with the mystic writing pad while he scribbled down the double signs of the death of childhood and of the birth of psychoanalysis. So that would be off the map, as it were.
And especially because another thing I've understood what kind of what you're trying to do. I mean, are you providing a context in which to understand, the case history? Or are you trying to interpret the case?
Yeah.
I get confused as to what exactly you're trying
One
to
of the things I'm trying to do is just represent some of the materials of the case history, as it were, phenomenologically, for you to see what it has in it, some of the things it does do. But superficially, for example, could easily say, well, it's just a play on Freud's. Can't possibly be a scientific reasoner. It's just a play on words, Zeugness, but to give it an interpretation of that say, well, it's not just a play on words, because such an account specifically omits the unconscious, which surfaces in these linguistic chains. They don't have a complete. They don't ever achieve a closure. They carry a story that connects to a next story that connects to a next story, and it's that kind of thing. If we had the actual case history page by page and line by line, we will see it making deference to other notions of syllogistic, logical argument, appeal where it's possible to the language of the biological language of diseases, or the language of gynecology. We will see that while you would think a medical report which is this, that, and the other, it's got an introduction, it addresses its reader, it has footnotes. The patient is at times left suspended while Freud conducts a priority claims battle, addressing his simultaneous construction of the history of the psychoanalytic movement. So that all of those things are a case history. There are strong places in it where, for example, Freud's got, as it were, early works and later works, and we conventionally sort of hive off the later socio-cultural works. But one of the things I think is useful is the Lichtenberg quotation shows you that the way these minds work, their program is, as it were, there from the beginning, and this is a very strong place to see how Freud creates his cultural rereading. Of course, that history has occurred, and he recreates it, and so I'm trying to show all of those things that go on. And of course, I have a rival interpretive point, this, for what it's worth, this idea that the baby is trying to solve a problem set to it by its parents, which is, as it were, an ontological, not just a piece of what Freud calls the infantile sexual theorist, trying to solve where the babies come from in that sexual, secular sense. I think there's a sense of the Versöhnung. That the child is trying to reconcile the marriage from which she came as a piece of trouble between parents and child. So that's that's worth whatever it's worth. That's my transference.
I have a question on what your project is. I can see where you are examining the case history and then connecting it to Freud's own case history as you are finding it in his notes, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But on what grounds can you bring in everything else, which is Freud's biography,
or even the book,
the culture, the time, etc.,
Yeah.
which is, it seems to me, more of a constructive rendering and imaginative, etc., compelling as it might be, but it's, on what grounds can one bring in virtually anything from that exterior to the
It's Freud's.
stay with the text that was not-
We could stay with the text if we start with one page. We can easily, give them for 2 hours or 1 hour. It's very easy to stay in that sense. But these are all Freud's texts. And he,
Life is
no,
life as a text as well.
oh, he textualized. Freud has almost no life outside of the text. Everything goes into the Freud text, and he uses it. Remember, Freud's self. Well, one of the things we've got here is Freud's self-analysis. Freud, he only goes into the case histories. They're overlapping with his own self-analysis of his dreams. So when I'm saying that the transference is not just working in the sense that, you know, Freud kind of likes Ratman, or he doesn't like Dora, or he likes him and he doesn't like her. It's an intertextual game, the transference. And he's already read his experiences through mythologies, through political events, through stories, through jokes. So it's in this...
So are you saying what you introduce as what's happened in his life is available to you in the same material, not that you're bringing it from...
Yeah, I'm not bringing it in from, say, like Jones's biography. I've never read that. No. No. Yeah, it could, but I'm not. I've never even read the biography. Freud is his own biographer, but, you know, in a Freudian way, because he wants his own... I would put it like this: Freud is the only case history he has. He hears the others through himself. And he generalizes, as I said this at the very beginning, he generalizes it. His sense of responding to the sampling question and the induction-deduction problem is that it's a humanist trope. I can hear myself in others, and I can hear others in myself, especially if they're good enough others. You know, if I get Ratman, I've got Hamlet. If I get Hamlet, I've got Ratman, and I've got both. I think that's how. But you know, the case histories are very definite things. They're not bricolage.
Right, but it's still unclear to me, without having that material, how it is that you organize it in the way that you do, to sort of privilege one reading of it versus another.
What I do in the larger sense is I start by going through the case history as nearly as possible as it tells itself. That, of course, breaks down. It's the sort of bi-columnar writing business that if you start telling the case histories as they can be read, rather than the way they're always abstracted and referred to in ritualistic ways in psychoanalytic reading, where you lose this sort of detail, you lay that out. That's the first run. Then, within that, I start to make a reflexive reference to the reading practices themselves. And what I try to do is not mention Derrida, Lyotard, or all the other readers, and take their language and pose it on Freud, but say that I think that if you take the honest way in which Freud's own writing continuously undoes itself, you've got the practice of deconstructive writing that the modernist writer that Freud is. If you like, you could extrapolate it to postmodernism. I just want to say that it's enough to see that it allows for its own skizzing. It's continuously addressing its own attempts to achieve closure. I do think it would reject, however, say a strong claim like Derrida's "Il n'y a pas de hors texte." I would say that if Derrida's, in effect, got a double claim. There's no outside of the text, and yet no text can avoid its margins invading it. So I'm saying that if you take like Freud's got to be a good enough text, and you see what's at work in it, then these issues don't need to be rendered somebody else's property. That's perhaps all I'm saying. So I wouldn't want to write as a Derridian or a Guattarian or what. I think of it in a sense as a phenomenology of that written page.
Or are you writing it as a psychoanalytic as well?
I am when at the level where I want to save these kids and the mother body. Of course, that's me producing a Christian working the Christian Catholic mythology mythology against the Greco-Judaic end. I think there's a triple mythology at work in Freud. There's a Judeo-Greek mythology at work, and through his nanny, of course, he knows the Christian mythologies. But they have to be pushed underground in terms of this Lichtenberg reversal. I suppose to the extent that I throw myself at the thing at the end, it will be on that angle of it. Also, I think the idea of showing that the mapping, the idea of mapping a problem or rendering it with a device like a map and a legend, that the legend can't possibly, so far from the map correcting the text, and the text, to the extent that it's corrected by the map, at best going to the legend that the map needs. In fact, the legend becomes larger than the original text to save the map. That's only an after. It's there in the sense of the little map in the case history. The thing I gave you about the peremptory idea system, that's not worked through at all at the moment. But it's another sort of exercise. But it's important. In the case of Little Humps, which reads, it's an enormously long case, and it seems like an unlikely case, but it gets to be extraordinarily rich, and then it starts to turn off a map as to a way of, as it were, an attempt to render in this literally way scenic what could have been going on. And you say, well, wait a minute, Freud is doing that, and he's doing it at that point to save the way he wants to Oedipalize what I would say he wants to put it's a way not to do what he needs to do, which is, and what he needs to do, excuse the pun, is to put the cart before the horse. The cart, the wagon, is the Magen, is the mother tummy that's full. And Little Hans is reading the mother tummy. And Freud wants him to read the horse that pulls and identify with the father and say, think about the father impregnating the mother. So they're not just metaphorical games. They create misleading analytic strategies. But in that sense, I mean, strategies of analysis that themselves get lost. Not, right?
We have to leave now.
Oh, yeah, all right.
Class coming in.
Right.
I'd like to thank you for
Yeah. Thanks.
Wish we had more time to do some of this stuff. Yeah, we'll have to do a quick